Imagine this. You live in a small community, completely trusting your leader, only to find out a couple of years later that he considers himself a god and everyone's lives are in his hands. This isn't fiction. These are real cults that existed, and some still exist today. Today we're going to look at 5 of the most terrifying cults in history. The last story is from the 21st century, and it will give you goosebumps. Hey everyone, welcome back to History Time. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button so you don't miss our upcoming videos on humanity's darkest stories. And definitely let us know in the comments which of these cults you've already heard about. Let's see who knows their history best. The Order of the Solar Temple. In the 1990s, investigators in Switzerland entered a building and discovered something that looked almost impossible. Inside were dozens of dead bodies. Some had been shot. Others had been drugged or suffocated. Several buildings had been set on fire. At first, investigators couldn't understand what they were looking at. It wasn't a normal crime scene. It wasn't a simple mass suicide either. The people who died belonged to a secretive religious organization known as the Order of the Solar Temple. And what made the case even more disturbing was what many of them believed about death. They didn't necessarily see it as the end. They believed it could be a journey. The Order of the Solar Temple emerged in the 1980s, mainly in Switzerland and France. Its 2 most important figures were Joseph de Mambro, a French occultist, and Luc Jouret, a Belgian doctor who became involved in alternative medicine and esoteric spirituality. Together, they created a movement that mixed several different traditions. There were references to the Knights Templar, ancient mysteries, astrology, Christianity, and New Age beliefs. The organization presented itself as a spiritual order whose members possessed knowledge hidden from ordinary society. Members were encouraged to believe that humanity was approaching a major transformation. The world they knew would eventually disappear. But the people who were spiritually prepared would continue their existence on another level. The leaders claimed that Earth was only one stage in a much larger cosmic journey. And for some followers, these ideas became more important than their ordinary lives. The organization was highly secretive. It had different levels of membership, ceremonies, symbols, rituals, and private meetings. The higher someone rose within the organization, the more they supposedly learned. This created a powerful sense of exclusivity. Members weren't simply attending another religious group. They were told they belonged to a special spiritual elite. They were different. They were chosen. And they believed their leaders possessed knowledge that outsiders could never understand. By the early 1990s, the order had hundreds of members across several countries. Many were ordinary people with jobs, families, and homes. Some were wealthy. Some were professionals. From the outside, there was nothing obviously unusual about them. But inside the organization, the idea of a coming transformation was becoming increasingly important. Eventually, the leaders began talking about leaving the physical world. One of the central ideas of the solar temple was that human existence continued beyond death. The physical body was temporary. The spiritual self was eternal. The group also developed beliefs involving the star Sirius and a future existence beyond Earth. To someone outside the organization, these ideas sounded bizarre. But inside the group, they were presented as spiritual truth. And this distinction would become extremely important. Because once death was no longer seen as an ending, it could be presented as a transition, a journey, a passage to another world. The leaders did not simply tell followers that they should die. Instead, the idea was built around a much larger belief system. Members were gradually taught that their real destination was somewhere beyond their physical existence. And eventually, that belief became deadly. On September 30th, 1994, the first major tragedy occurred in Canada. In Morin Heights, Quebec, several members of the group were found dead. Among them was a 3-month-old baby. Investigators would later discover that these deaths were connected to the solar temple. But this was only the beginning. A few days later, on October 5th, Swiss authorities made a horrifying discovery. At a farm in Chéry, 23 bodies were found. Many of the victims had been shot or drugged. The building had also been deliberately set on fire. On the same day, another 25 bodies were discovered in Salvan, Switzerland. In total, dozens of people connected to the solar temple had died. And among the dead were the organization's 2 central leaders. Luc Jouret was dead. Joseph de Mambro was dead. At first, authorities believed the organization had reached its final moment. But the investigation quickly became more complicated. Some victims appeared to have participated voluntarily. Others had clearly been murdered. There were also children among the dead. It became almost impossible to divide the victims neatly into categories of suicide and murder. Then something even stranger happened. The deaths did not stop. More than a year later, on December 23, 1995, French authorities discovered another group of bodies. 16 people had died in the Vercors region of France. The bodies had been arranged in a star-like formation. The symbolism appeared deliberate. The solar temple's founders were already dead, yet their ideas were still powerful enough to influence their followers. This raised a terrifying question. How could people continue to follow a movement after its leaders had already died? The answer seemed to be buried inside the group's beliefs. The followers didn't necessarily think they were simply ending their lives. Some believed they were completing a spiritual journey. They believed they were leaving one world and entering another. The final known deaths connected to the solar temple occurred in Quebec in March 1997. 5 adults were found dead inside a house in Saint-Casimir. 3 teenagers were discovered alive. The adults had apparently planned another death ritual, but the teenagers did not want to die. They resisted. They wanted to live. And their survival became one of the most disturbing details of the entire case. It demonstrated that even inside the same family, people could have completely different ideas about what was happening. Some believed death was necessary. Others desperately wanted to survive. Between 1994 and 1997, 74 people connected to the Solar Temple died in Switzerland, France, and Canada. The organization that had promised its members spiritual enlightenment had instead become associated with one of the most disturbing series of deaths in modern European history. Its leaders were gone, many of its followers were gone, and the movement itself effectively collapsed. But the mystery surrounding the Solar Temple never completely disappeared. How many people truly wanted to die? How many were murdered? How many were manipulated? And how many genuinely believed they were traveling to another world? Those questions are difficult to answer even today. The order of the Solar Temple is disturbing not simply because people died. It is disturbing because the road to those deaths began with something that seemed harmless. A search for meaning, a search for spirituality, a belief that there was something greater beyond ordinary life. The danger came when that belief became absolute, when the leaders became more important than reality, and when death itself stopped being seen as the end. For the members of the Solar Temple, the promised journey was supposed to take them somewhere beyond Earth. Instead, it ended with 74 dead, and left behind one of the darkest questions surrounding cults. How far can people be convinced to go when they believe their leaders possess the ultimate truth? The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. On the morning of March 17, 2000, something terrible happened in a remote part of southwestern Uganda. A small church building in the village of Kanungu suddenly burst into flames. Inside were hundreds of members of a religious movement. The doors and windows had been sealed. There was almost no way out. When the fire finally burned itself out, investigators discovered a horrifying scene. Hundreds of bodies were lying inside the destroyed building. At first, authorities believed they were looking at one of the largest mass suicides in modern history. But then they started finding bodies somewhere else, and what they discovered changed the entire story. This was not simply a group of people choosing to die together. It appeared that many of them had already been murdered. The group was called the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. It emerged in Uganda during the late 1980s and was founded around two central figures, Credonia Mwerinde and Joseph Kibwetere. Mwerinde claimed that she had experienced visions of the Virgin Mary. Kibwetere, a former politician and deeply religious man, believed her. Together, they created a movement that presented itself as a return to true Christianity. The group was heavily influenced by Catholic traditions, but it rejected parts of the established Catholic Church and developed its own interpretation of religion. Its central message was simple and terrifying. The end of the world was coming. The leaders claimed that humanity had become sinful and that God would soon destroy the existing world. Only those who followed the movement and obeyed its teachings would survive. The group became increasingly strict. Members were expected to follow detailed religious rules. They were encouraged to give up their possessions and hand money over to the movement. Some members sold their homes, land, and livestock. The group also established isolated communities where followers could live together. They grew their own food, they built houses, they established schools, and they increasingly separated themselves from the outside world. Some members reportedly limited ordinary speech because they feared saying something sinful. The leaders also demanded absolute loyalty. For followers, questioning the movement could mean questioning God himself. And as the year 2000 approached, the group's predictions became increasingly specific. The leaders announced that the world would soon end. The original date passed. January 1st, 2000 arrived. Nothing happened. The world did not end. There was no apocalypse. For the movement, this should have been a devastating moment. Members had given away their possessions. They had abandoned ordinary lives. They had trusted the leaders. And now the prophecy had failed. People began asking questions. Some followers reportedly wanted their money and possessions back. The movement began losing support. But instead of admitting that the prophecy had been wrong, the leaders announced another date. The new date was March 17th, 2000. This time, they claimed, the end would definitely come. And preparations began. In the days before March 17th, members gathered at the movement's compound in Kanungu. They had little reason to suspect that this would be their final day. The group reportedly held celebrations and religious gatherings. There was food. There were drinks. People gathered together. But behind the scenes, something much darker was happening. Investigators later discovered evidence suggesting that members had been killed before the final fire. Some victims had been poisoned. Others had been strangled or stabbed. Bodies were hidden in pits and other locations connected to the movement. This meant that the deaths had not started on March 17th. They had been happening for weeks, possibly longer. Then came the fire. Hundreds of followers entered the church. The doors and windows were closed. The building was set on fire. Within minutes, the wooden structure became an inferno. The people inside had almost no chance of escaping. When the flames died down, the building contained hundreds of bodies. The exact number was difficult to determine because many of the bodies had been burned beyond recognition. Early reports gave much lower estimates, but as investigators searched properties connected to the movement, the number of dead continued to rise. At one location, dozens of bodies were discovered hidden in a latrine. At another, investigators found a mass grave containing more than 150 people. Other bodies were discovered at properties belonging to movement leaders. Many showed signs of poisoning, strangulation, or other violence. The picture was becoming clear. The fire was only the final part of something much larger. The police began treating the case as a mass murder. Their theory was that the movement's leaders had promised their followers that the world would end. But when the first prophecy failed, the group began to collapse. Members wanted answers. Some wanted their possessions back. The leadership was losing control. According to investigators, the leaders responded with violence. Rather than allow the movement to fall apart, they allegedly began eliminating their own followers. The final fire may have been intended to make the deaths look like a mass suicide. But the discovery of the earlier bodies made that explanation much harder to believe. And then came another mystery. The movement's main leaders were nowhere to be found. Joseph Kibwetere and Credonia Mwerinde were believed to have died in the fire. but investigators could not definitively identify their bodies. They were never successfully prosecuted. Their ultimate fate remains uncertain. Some reports have claimed that Kibwetere survived and escaped Uganda, but no confirmed sighting has ever established what happened to him. The final death toll is difficult to establish with absolute certainty. Different investigations and sources have produced different numbers. At least several hundred people died in the Kanungu fire and the killings that preceded it. Later investigations placed the total at hundreds more, with estimates reaching roughly 778 to more than 900 deaths. Among the victims were many women and children, people who had trusted the movement, people who had given away their possessions, people who believed they were preparing for salvation, and people who may never have understood what was really happening. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God disappeared after the massacre. Its leaders vanished, its communities were abandoned, and the people who had once believed that they were preparing for the end of the world were gone. But the tragedy left behind a disturbing lesson. The most dangerous part of the movement was not simply its prediction that the world would end. It was the complete control its leaders eventually gained over their followers. They convinced people to abandon their possessions. They convinced them to isolate themselves. They convinced them that the outside world was dangerous. And when the prophecy failed, they apparently convinced many of them that there was no other future. On March 17, 2000, hundreds of people entered a church in Kanungu. They believed they were approaching the end of the world. Instead, they became victims of one of the deadliest cult tragedies in modern history. And the question that remains is perhaps the darkest one of all. How many of those people walked into that church believing they were going to heaven, without knowing that someone had already decided they were never going to leave? The Ant Hill Kids, 1977, Quebec and Ontario, Canada. Roch Thériault was born in 1947 in a small town in Quebec to a deeply religious Catholic family. As a boy, he dropped out of school and immersed himself in reading the Old Testament. He was fascinated by stories of divine wrath and retribution. As he grew up, he briefly joined the Seventh-day Adventists, but soon his obsession with his own uniqueness and his thirst for power alienated even his fellow believers. In 1978, he was expelled from the church. This didn't stop Thériault. In 1977, he proclaimed himself a prophet named Moses and declared that the truth about the impending end of the world had been revealed solely to him. People began to gather around him, mostly young families disillusioned with ordinary life and the traditional church. He convinced them to quit their jobs, cut ties with relatives, and move with him into the deep woods of eastern Quebec. Thus emerged the community that Thériault himself jokingly called the Ant Hill, because everyone lived and worked together, harvesting maple syrup, preserves, and smoked fish. This is where the name came from, the Ant Hill Kids. At first, the commune seemed completely harmless. People just wanted to live a simpler life and prepare for the apocalypse, which Thériault claimed would happen on February 19, 1979. But as that date drew near, the leader himself changed drastically. He began drinking heavily, and with the alcohol, his paranoia grew. Thériault declared that every woman in the community was obligated to become his wife and bear his children. This was framed as a religious duty. Over his lifetime, he had about a dozen wives and fathered 26 children. When the appointed day of the apocalypse passed and the world didn't collapse, any other leader would have lost the trust of their followers. But Theriot had an answer. He claimed he had simply confused man's time with God's time, and that the apocalypse was still coming, just a bit later. The people, having invested their entire lives in him, believed him. After that, Theriot's control became absolute. He forbade community members from speaking to one another without his permission. He organized so-called gladiator tournaments, forcing his followers to fight each other for his own amusement. The punishments grew increasingly brutal. Beatings with belts, hammers, and axes. To leave no doubt among his followers about his divinity, he staged elaborate performances, screaming dramatically at the sky as if arguing with God himself, who was allegedly forcing him to punish the offenders. Completely broken psychologically, the people genuinely believed their tormentor was merely an instrument of a higher power, and that their suffering was a sacred test. The most horrific events took place under the guise of medical care. Having no education whatsoever, Theriot called himself a healer and performed wild surgeries on his followers, supposedly to cast out illnesses and evil forces. It was during one of these procedures that Geraldine Auclair died. Later, he killed an infant named Samuel Giguère, and in 1989, a murder occurred that ultimately destroyed the commune. Theriot performed a failed intestinal surgery without anesthesia on his follower, Solange Boislard, causing her to die in agony. Even earlier, in a fit of rage, he severed the arm of another wife, Gabrielle Lavallee, with a chainsaw, allegedly to cast out the devil from her. She survived, but was left disabled for life. It was her testimony, along with that of other survivors, that later formed the core of the criminal case. For years, the police and social services knew nothing about what was happening. The commune hid deep in the wilderness, and the few who tried to escape were afraid to tell the truth. Everything changed when social worker Paula Jackson suspected something was wrong and launched an investigation. Gradually, the truth about the torture, mutilation, and murders began to surface, and in 1989, following the death of Solange Boislard, Theriot was finally arrested. In 1993, the court found him guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. It seemed that this gruesome story had finally come to an end. But what's most terrifying is that even behind bars, Theriot retained his influence. Several of his former wives continued to visit him and remain loyal to the man who had tormented them for years. Nothing shows more clearly how deeply a charismatic tyrant's control can penetrate a person's psyche. The final chapter in this story was written not by the justice system, but by a prison cell. On February 26, 2011, after almost 18 years of imprisonment, 63-year-old Theriot was found dead, stabbed by a cellmate who apparently simply took a disliking to him. The killer was sentenced to life in prison. And so ended the life of a man who started as a preacher and ended as one of the most brutal tyrants in the history of Canadian cults. The Family International. In the late 1960s, a religious movement began spreading through the United States. Its message sounded simple: reject the ordinary world, follow Jesus, live together as one spiritual family, and dedicate your entire life to spreading the message. Thousands of people would eventually join. They would give up their homes, their jobs, and, in many cases, their connection to ordinary society. The movement became known as the Family International. But behind its message of love and salvation was a system that would eventually become one of the most controversial religious movements of the 20th century. And at the center of it was a man who called himself David Berg. David Berg was a Christian preacher who became increasingly critical of mainstream American society during the 1960s. He believed that churches had become too focused on money, material possessions, and conventional morality. He wanted something radically different. Around 1968, he began attracting young followers in California. They were mostly young people searching for an alternative to the traditional lifestyle of their parents. Berg presented himself as a spiritual leader who could show them another way to live. His followers began living communally. They shared money, they shared food, they traveled together, they preached on streets, and they tried to separate themselves from the values of mainstream society. The movement was initially known as the Children of God. The name would later change several times, eventually becoming the Family International. The group grew rapidly. Members traveled across the United States and later moved into other countries. They lived in large communal houses known as colonies. Members were expected to dedicate themselves almost completely to the movement. They were not simply attending religious services once a week. The movement became their entire world. Their friends were members. Their homes were controlled by the group. Their work was controlled by the group. And their religious beliefs were shaped by David Berg. Berg communicated with his followers through a constant stream of letters and publications. These writings became known as the Mo letters. To many followers, Berg's words were treated as spiritual guidance. He could tell members how they should live, what they should believe, and how they should raise their children. The movement became increasingly isolated from mainstream society. But the most controversial part of Berg's teachings involved sexuality. The movement rejected many traditional ideas about relationships and marriage. Berg argued that sexuality could be used as part of religious work. Female members were encouraged to use sexual relationships with outsiders as a method of attracting people to the movement. This practice became known as flirty fishing. The idea was that a woman could establish a sexual relationship with a potential recruit and then introduce that person to the group's religious teachings. The practice attracted enormous controversy, but it also demonstrated something important about the movement. The boundaries between religion, personal relationships, and obedience to leadership had almost completely disappeared. What someone did privately could now be considered part of their religious duty. As the movement expanded internationally, children were growing up inside the colonies. They were surrounded almost entirely by members of the group. Their parents followed the teachings of the movement. Their education was often organized within the community, and the group's religious ideology shaped almost every part of daily life. Former members later described an environment in which questioning leadership could have serious consequences. Leaving was not always simple. A person who left could lose their home, their friends, and sometimes contact with family members who remained inside. For children, the situation could be even more complicated. They had been raised to believe that the outside world was dangerous or spiritually corrupt. The movement had become their entire reality. During the 1970s and 1980s, reports and allegations concerning the treatment of children inside the movement began attracting increasing attention. Authorities in different countries investigated some of the group's communities. Former members publicly described harsh discipline and controversial teachings. The organization faced accusations concerning child abuse and exploitation. The movement denied many of the allegations and changed some of its practices over time. Eventually, the Family International introduced reforms. Its leadership acknowledged that some earlier teachings had caused serious problems. The movement also changed its structure and policies regarding children, but its earlier history continued to follow it. David Berg died in 1994. By then, the movement had already changed considerably, but his influence remained enormous. For decades, he had been the central authority. His writings had shaped the beliefs of thousands of followers. After his death, the organization continued under new leadership and eventually adopted the name the Family International. The movement also became more decentralized. It continued operating internationally, but its structure was different from the tightly controlled communities of its earlier years. The story of the Family International is different from many of the famous cult tragedies. There was no single night when hundreds of people died. There was no burning church. There was no final massacre. Instead, the disturbing part of the story was how completely an alternative society could develop around one charismatic leader. People entered looking for spirituality. They found a community. Then the community became their family. The family became their entire social world. And eventually, the leader's teachings could influence almost every part of their lives. Thousands of people passed through the movement during its history. Some stayed for decades. Others eventually escaped. Many former members described the experience as difficult to leave behind because they had spent their childhood or entire adult lives inside the organization. For them, leaving wasn't simply changing religion. It meant learning how to live in a world they had been taught to distrust. That is what makes the Family International such a disturbing example of a high-control religious movement. It didn't need walls around its followers. The walls were psychological. The movement could convince people that the outside world was dangerous, while the community itself was the only place where they truly belonged. And once that belief becomes strong enough, freedom can become difficult to recognize. The story of the Family International is ultimately not just about religion. It is about what happens when a spiritual community places extraordinary power in the hands of one person. Because the most dangerous prison does not always have locked doors. Sometimes it is a world where everyone you love believes the same thing. And leaving means losing almost everything you know. Love has won. In 2021, police entered a house in rural Colorado after receiving a disturbing report. Inside the house, they found several people. There were children. There were members of a small spiritual movement. And in one of the rooms was something that looked like a shrine. At the center of it was a woman's body. The body had been wrapped in a sleeping bag and decorated with Christmas lights. Glitter had been placed around the eyes. The people inside the house had not simply hidden the body. They appeared to have been treating it as something sacred. The dead woman was Amy Carlson. To her followers, she was not simply a woman. She was Mother God. And this was the final chapter of one of the strangest modern cult stories in America. Amy Carlson became involved in the spiritual movement that would eventually become Love Has Won in the 2000s. Her followers believed that she possessed a divine identity. Carlson claimed she was billions of years old. She said she had lived many previous lives. Among the identities she associated with herself were Jesus, Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, and Marilyn Monroe. She also claimed that she was the embodiment of God on earth. Her followers called her Mother God. The group combined ideas from Christianity, New Age spirituality, reincarnation, extraterrestrials, and conspiracy theories. To outsiders, the belief system looked completely bizarre. But to people who joined the movement, it offered something different: a purpose, a community, and the promise that they were participating in a massive transformation of humanity. Carlson claimed that the Earth was moving toward a new spiritual age. She called this coming reality the fifth dimension. According to her teachings, humanity was approaching a major transformation. She believed she would eventually ascend. Her followers were told that they had an important role in preparing the world. The group also produced a huge amount of online content. Videos were uploaded almost constantly. Carlson appeared in broadcasts from inside the group's homes. Followers spoke to viewers about spirituality, energy, and their leader. The internet became one of the movement's most important recruiting tools. People who were searching online for spirituality or alternative explanations could suddenly encounter Carlson. Some former members later said they initially joined because they were looking for meaning or going through difficult periods in their lives. The movement offered them an explanation for everything, and it offered them a place to belong. But life inside the group could be extremely demanding. Former members described strict rules and unusual living conditions. The group reportedly restricted sleep and expected members to spend long periods standing. Alcohol was discouraged for ordinary members, while Carlson herself struggled with serious health problems. She eventually became physically very ill. Despite this, she continued to present herself as a powerful spiritual being. She claimed that she could perform spiritual healing. She spoke about being able to repair illnesses through spiritual energy. Her followers continued to believe that she was something far beyond an ordinary human being. And this created a strange contradiction. If Mother God was truly divine, why was she becoming so sick? The answer given inside the movement was not always clear, but the followers continued to believe. By 2020, the group had become increasingly controversial. Members traveled together and attempted to establish themselves in different locations. At one point,
they traveled to Hawaii. Local residents became concerned about the group's presence. Authorities and community members pressured them to leave. Eventually, the group returned to the mainland United States. By this point, Carlson's health was deteriorating. She reportedly had severe mobility problems and was sometimes described as being unable to walk normally. Yet she continued to tell followers about her coming ascension. She claimed that she was preparing for a transformation that would take her beyond the physical world. For her followers, her illness did not necessarily disprove her claims. Instead, it became part of the mystery surrounding Mother God. Then, in April 2021, something happened that would bring the entire movement into the international spotlight. Amy Carlson died. She was only 45 years old. Her body was transported to a house near Moffett, Colorado, where members of Love Has Won were staying. But instead of reporting her death to authorities immediately, the followers kept her body inside the house. When police eventually arrived, they found her remains in a state of advanced decomposition and mummification. The body had been placed in a sleeping bag. Christmas lights had been wrapped around it. Glitter makeup surrounded the eyes. Investigators described the arrangement as a kind of shrine. The scene was so unusual that it immediately attracted international attention.
7 members of the group were arrested. They faced charges related to abuse of a corpse, and there were also child abuse allegations because children were found living in the house. But the investigation produced another surprising detail. There was no evidence that Carlson had been murdered. A later autopsy concluded that her death was associated with alcohol abuse, anorexia, and chronic ingestion of colloidal silver. Authorities did not find evidence of cancer, despite claims surrounding her health. The charges against the followers were eventually dropped. But one question remained. Why had they kept her body? The answer came from their beliefs. To the people inside the house, Carlson was not simply dead. She had ascended. They believed that Mother God had moved into another state of existence. The body that police discovered was therefore not necessarily viewed by the followers as a corpse in the ordinary sense. It was the physical remains of a divine being, something sacred, something they were not ready to let go. The discovery of Carlson's body effectively destroyed Love Has Won as it had existed. The movement splintered. Different followers developed competing beliefs about what should happen next. Some continued to believe in Carlson. Others left. Some created new spiritual groups. But the original movement never recovered. And the story of Mother God became one of the strangest examples of an internet-era cult. Unlike older religious movements, Love Has Won did not rely entirely on isolated compounds or secret meetings. It used YouTube, social media, online broadcasts, internet communities. People could encounter the movement without ever meeting Carlson in person. The cult could reach someone sitting alone in their bedroom thousands of kilometers away. That changed the way recruitment could happen. The story of Love Has Won is disturbing because it shows how an ancient phenomenon can take a completely modern form. The basic pattern was familiar: a charismatic leader, a group of people searching for meaning, a belief system that explained the world, a community that gradually became more important than life outside the group, and eventually a leader whose identity became inseparable from the beliefs of her followers. But there was one final difference. This time, the entire story unfolded in front of cameras. Carlson's followers recorded their lives. They broadcast their beliefs. They spoke directly to strangers online. And after Mother God died, the internet preserved almost everything. The videos remained. The recordings remained. The followers' words remained. And so did the photographs of the house where her body was discovered. Amy Carlson believed she was Mother God. Her followers believed she would ascend to another dimension. But in April 2021, there was no miraculous transformation. There was only a house in rural Colorado, a group of followers, a shrine, and the body of a woman who had convinced others that she was something more than human. Love Has Won did not end with an apocalypse. It ended with police arriving at a quiet house and discovering that the people inside had been living beside the body of their dead leader. And perhaps that is what makes the story so unsettling. The most powerful part of a cult is not always the leader. Sometimes it is the belief that remains after the leader is gone. Because even when Mother God died, some of her followers still believed she was alive somewhere beyond this world. And that's where we'll end today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. More disturbing stories are coming soon. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.